I want to welcome everybody to Psalm 142, as today's honoree is Rabbi Rick Steinberg of Temple Shir Hamalot in Irvine. This psalm, Psalm 142, is paired with tomorrow's Psalm 143 in that they share phrases and style. Linda and I were watching last night the Antique Roadshow, and somebody presented an artwork of sailboats from Danish architect artist, and there were two of these. One was signed and one was unsigned. And the expert said to the woman, you need to keep these always together because the unsigned takes on increased value by being paired with the signed one. It's clear that they go together. And so for the editor of Psalms, Psalm 142 and 143 are paired. And what they have in common, as we'll see as well tomorrow, is a lot of phrases taken from other Psalms or other parts of Scripture. They're very collage, montage-like in a distinctive way. Now, this Psalm, Psalm 142, will be identified in its introduction as a maskil of David, a prayer. When he was in the cave. So it's actually given a specific moment. It's the only psalm in what's called the fifth book of Psalms, Psalm 107 to 150, identified with a particular moment. We've seen this identification before. Psalm 57:1 identifies the psalm as when David was in the cave fleeing Saul. In this case, it just says when David was in the cave, and as is our people's nature, there will be a debate as to which cave. There are two possible caves in the first book of Samuel. Chapter 22 is the cave of Adullam. It's given a name. He has just fled from the kings of the south, what is now Jordan, and come to hide in a cave. Or there's a second story, a couple chapters later, chapter 24, of King David hiding from Saul in En-Gedi, near the Dead Sea, where he will clip the hem of the king to show that he could have done worse, but wanted to honor the king. At the same time, in this particular psalm, the king describes himself as all alone. But in both of those stories, in the first book of Samuel, King David is accompanied by his loyal soldiers. So there's a bit of a tension or a disconnect there. And of course, like all the Psalms, we don't know when it's attributed to David, if it's in fact written by him or written by a psalmist identifying with being pursued. And so just like David had to hide in the cave, so I in this moment am seeking shelter, the darkness, the seclusion, and the protection. As I begin the psalm, the thing to note are the verbs. Follow the verbs in order to see the distinctive nature, the trajectory of this psalm. As is the case, the title is taken by picking a phrase from verse 3, I pour out before God. A maskil of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. My voice to Adonai, I shout out. My voice to Adonai, I plea for grace. I pour out before God my speech, my trouble before God I tell. When my spirit is enwrapped upon me, and you have known my path. On this way that I walk, they have hidden a snare for me. Looking rightward, and seeing there is no one who recognizes me, lost from me is my place to escape. No one asks after my soul. I shouted to you, Adonai, I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my ringing cry, for I am brought very low. Save me from my pursuers, for they are mightier than me. Bring out from prison my soul to give thanks to your name. Through me, the righteous will crown themselves, for you will bestow kindness upon me. Now, the closing line is a shift from the rest of the psalm, as is often the case in psalms. And the verb form, which is the imperfect, can be bring out, or it can be may you bring out, or let me be brought out. I choose to see the conclusion as a statement of confidence rather than prayer per se. But that's an option, and both are possible, and both are probably simultaneously true. I said follow the verbs. So listen to these verbs. With my voice, I'll come back to that. And everything flows from prayer, my voice, and the verbs. I shout out, I plead, I pour out, I tell. I shouted, verse 6. I said, verse 7. Attend. Now, all of that, verses 1 to 7, all those verbs lead to 7b, which is save me. And then verse 8, bring out from prison. And so the trajectory of the opening verse to 7a is repeated synonyms for listen to me. I'm calling to you. I'm pleading with you. I'm telling you. And then save me as the verb, as the goal, bring me out. And then this again concluding line, which we'll come back to. Now it begins with this phrase, a prayer of David, that we get in two other psalms, Psalm 17 and Psalm 86. And again, David, already in the book of Samuel, is identified with his ability to turn to God. The words that get repeated, the phrases that get repeated, also convey the message. Verse 2, Koli el Adonai, my voice to Adonai, gets repeated twice. And then in verse 3, Lifanav, Lifanav, before him, before God. My voice to God before him. Already a biblical commentator in Portugal, the 16th century, Yosef ibn Yahya, said in regard to the opening of my voice, that here David is so terrified and confused that his words fail. Hence, just hear my voice, God, fill in the words. I mentioned that what is distinctive about Psalm 142 and 143, that more than other psalms, they are montage-like in terms of words and phrases that echo other psalms and other parts of the Bible tomorrow. My sense is, again, the psalms are art. Things are chosen purposefully. I would surmise that this style of repeating words and phrases from elsewhere convey that he himself lacks words. He has his voice, he has his yearning, but he can't quite articulate it for himself. And that, I think, is part of the artistry, is conveying that lack of capacity to find the right word by repeating words that have, if you will, been said by psalmists elsewhere. course, you don't know which came first, 142 or the other Psalms, but more likely than not, modern Bible scholars would say Psalm 142 is a later composition by virtue of not just repeating words from one Psalms, but almost every verse has a phrase repeated somewhere else. So for instance, in verse 2, my voice to Adonai I shout out. Psalm 3, verse 5, Koli el Adonai, my voice to God, Ekra, I will call out, V'ya'aneni, and God will answer me. That phrase, El Adonai Ekra, is again not a quote, but the same content and mostly the same. And so that's in regard to style. Now, my voice to Adonai, I shout out. My voice to Adonai, I plead for grace. The word etchanan has as its root chen, kindness, though it's grace. Grace is kindness, expecting nothing back. It's an act of mercy. God, it is not about my merit. It is about your goodness. I pour out before God my speech, eshpoch. And here the image of eshpoch is pouring oneself out fully. You get this as well in Psalm 102, Yishpoch sicho, I have poured out my speech. And in 102, in that same verse, you get the next line. In 102, it's Ki ya'atef lefanai Adonai, when I am enwrapped before God, and my spirit is enwrapped upon me, is often translated as my spirit faints upon me. Richard Levy says in reference to this alai, this upon me, it's like in English where we say my battery died on me. So on me meaning I relied on it. Rather than literally, it's figurative. My spirit is enwrapped upon me. I like to see this image. Lihitatef is like ma'atefa, is an envelope. So I am enwrapped, meaning I'm all tangled up in blue. And you have known my path. Again, where we're going with this description is that to speak to God is to speak to a presence that is distinctive. When we talk to God, the assumption is, and you have known my path. The assumption is God knows us. What's distinctive about prayer, what's distinctive about a letter to God, is it's unfiltered, it's honest, because we're speaking to God who knows us, so therefore we can be unself-conscious in how we express ourselves. Even when we go to a therapist, we're looking, as we talk to the therapist, even when we're sharing our pain and our negativity, we're looking for affirmation, that the therapist likes us, despite what we may be saying. But in talking to God, one, we can't see God's reaction, but more, there's a sense that there's nothing to hide. There's no self-consciousness. God has known our path. Rashi, the Bible scholar of France, 11th century, will say that what is the path here being referred to is you have seen all the pitfalls and obstacles that I've had to contend with. Or Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, a generation later, will say, you have seen that I have sought righteousness. And so for those medieval Jewish commentators, there's the sense of here, and they see it as King David saying to God, you know, although I'm tangled up here, you know what I have pursued and the dangers I have faced. On this way that I walk, they have hidden a snare for me. And that too is a reoccurring theme. 143 verse 4, 141 last week we saw it in verses 9 and 10. The enemies planting snares. And so the psalmist is feeling endangered, but more, verse 5, he is feeling alone. Looking rightward and seeing there is no one who recognizes me. Now, looking rightward, often yemini, is identified with power. It's the hand you hold the sword. It's also the description of where God is, meaning God is our support to our right. So when I look rightward for support, or even for my own strength, and I see that no one recognizes me, lost for me is my place to escape. And when you get the mem, lanus is to escape, but when you get the mem in front, that indicates a place to escape. Ein doresh lenafshi, no one asks after my soul, which is to say, I am all alone. You've seen the dangers of those who seek to ensnare me, to entrap me, and I, God, have no one who cares about how I am doing. And therefore, I turn to you. Za'akti, I shouted. That's a word that is repeated. We saw it as ak in verse 2. It's the one word that gets repeated. My voice to Adonai, I shout out. And here again, I shouted to you, Adonai. And that conveys the quality of urgency, of pleading. And I said, you are my refuge, ata machsi, my portion in the land of the living, chelki be'eretz chayim. It's not clear what the portion in the land of the living refers to. Radak and Malbim say it refers to my portion in the land of Israel. Mitsudat Tzion says it's my portion here, literally in the land of the living, in contrast to both Rambam, Maimonides, and Ramban Nachmanides, who say it's in regard to the world to come. Sforno says it's what is the land of the living? It's the land of the Beit Midrash, the place of study. You are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Last, it's the contrast, the land of the living and refuge. It's the contrast to the grave. And so it will be used in Psalm 27:13 to refer, and Psalm 16:5 to be the contrast to the grave. And now the last two verses. Attend to my ringing cry. Also, rina can be attend to my joy. For I am brought very low. Ki daloti ma'od. Hatzileni mirodfai, save me from my pursuers. Ki amtsu mi many, for they are mightier, or made mighty. They are mightier than me. So verse 7, the Maggid of Dubno, who was a great teacher of parables. He was in the Vilna Gaon synagogue as a congregant in 18th century Lithuania, Vilna. And the Maggid, who was famous for his parables, takes this opening phrase, Hakshiva el rinati, attend to my joyful cry, Ki daloti ma'od, for I am brought very low. And he said, how do we understand these words of David? We understand them by a story of a very rich man who lost it all. Everybody in town knew that he was the man who had been rich, but he now had nothing and needed to beg. And he would simply ask for a kopek or two. And one day, somebody gave him a kopek, a penny, and said, come with me to my home. Let me serve you a hot meal. And he was so overjoyed to be invited to a hot meal that as they walked, he danced. And the people saw him dancing through the streets, and they said, Oi, how far he has fallen, that before what he would have taken for granted to be invited to a meal is now cause for celebration. And so the Maggid of Dubno says, Hakshiva el rinati, pay attention, God, to my rejoicing over triflings, ki daloti ma'od, for I have been brought so low that even a trifling is worthy of a celebration. The last line, Hotzi ami masger nafshi, bring out from prison my soul, lehodot et shemecha, which can either be understood as to give thanks to your name, to acclaim your name, to praise your name. We've seen over and over in Psalms that the purpose that people describe to God is their understanding of God's purpose in human creation is that we might sing God's praises, which is to say, to have both relationship with God as God's motivation in creation and more. Somehow, and this may be projection, God seeks and needs our praise, our gratitude, our affirmation. Bi yachtiru tzadikim, through me the righteous will crown themselves, ki tigmol alai, for the goodness you have bestowed on me. Now this last phrase can be understood in a variety of ways. One, there's two questions. Well, what is it? Who's getting crowned is the first question. And what's the role of the psalmist in the crowning? Is God getting crowned? Is the psalmist getting crowned? Or are the tzaddikim getting crowned? Three possibilities. Rashi will say, through me, the righteous will crown you. Radak, David Kimchi, will say, the righteous will use me, David, as an exemplar of rewards. In that sense, will see me, the exemplar, as what crowns them. The other way this strange word crowning can be understood is like a crown is on the top of the head encircling it. So yekatru is how the Septuagint reads it, the Greek translation, which means to encircle. So through me the righteous will encircle me, for you will bestow kindness upon me. Which is to say, when you, God, do the goodness from me, to me, for me, and it's framed in the future, or it could be the jussive, which is, may you, but in the future, when they see the goodness you've done to me, they too will praise you. They will gather around me to sing your praises. And so the punchline of this trajectory, after all of those verbs of crying out to God, pouring out oneself before God, then the verb shifts to save me. And when you save me, God, bringing me out from this sense of being imprisoned, then all the righteous will see your goodness and they will praise you just like me. Or they will see the goodness you did for me, and I will be the model of the goodness of reward that comes with faithfulness. So, in part because I'm honoring my friend and teacher, Rabbi Steinberg, I have a psychological bent to share. And that is, this is a psalm about the need to feel heard. The assumption is that there is a God who listens. And yet, over and over and with different words, the only word that gets repeated is shouting out. This psalmist who is feeling a quality of urgency about being in a dark place. Here, the cave can also be understood figuratively. The psalmist is feeling encircled by darkness. And the goal is not to be encircled by darkness, but to be encircled by people who are righteous. To feel here as if I am all alone is to feel depressed. That's the nature of depression. You feel boxed in, bizarre, in a narrow place. You feel as if you are on some level all alone. And the only one that can really know you, understand you, in this case, is God. You are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. And because I'm feeling in this dark place as if I would want to die, I am so depressed, I am as if I am dead, and yet there is hope. And the hope emerges from feeling heard. That's how Harold Kushner understands the punchline of the book of Job. And tomorrow in Psalm 143, we'll have even more of an echo of the book of Job. When a person is in despair, feels alone, then hearing oneself, and more importantly, feeling heard by God, gives one a sense of light, a sense of seeing the world a little differently, because there's a disconnect in this psalm. Here he says there is nobody who recognizes him, and yet in the closing line, there are righteous around him, or who he hopes will be around him. It's not all lost. And so Psalm 142 is a psalm of despair that leads to confidence by feeling heard by God. I, in my own counseling as a rabbi, feel I need to provide something a little different than a therapist, have in my approach to counseling inviting people to write a letter to God first, to describe what they're going through, what their needs are, their yearnings. In writing a letter to God, not unlike this psalm, there is self-revelation because it's unfiltered honesty, because God knows us. And then I will say, now write back to yourself, if you can, spontaneously, as if God is answering you. For to see ourselves as if through God's eyes is to have a different perspective on who we are, and is to call from our deepest values. And that exchange of letters to and from God provides a quality of surprise perspective. In this Psalm 142, in sum, the psalmist is either in a cave, it could be David, but more likely metaphorically and for all times, a psalm to be recited when one feels enveloped by darkness, believing that there are snares and it's hard to emerge, and yet feeling as if God knows us, we can call on God, and that our ringing cry, that's the last time, attend to my ringing cry, the last time before save me, is a double entendre. It's both attend to my cry, but it's also attend to my joy. Hikshiva el rinati. For in knowing I am heard, my cry is also tinged and informed by joy, knowing that you can save me from that which is enormous, can bring me out from my prison, and in doing so, enabling me to praise you, fulfill my purpose, and for others through me to do so too. With that, 10 o'clock straight up, my opportunity. Rabbi Rick, in hearing this psalm, all the more as a marriage and family counselor, what gets evoked, if anything, for you?
So much. First, I don't think there's a human being who can't relate to this psalm and to the beautiful way in which you interpreted it. I particularly like just the last thing that you said about the writing the letters, because my approach as a therapist is what we call a narrative therapy. That is, we each have a narrative we tell about ourselves. I'm a victim or I'm a survivor. I'm a this or I'm a that. And both can be true, by the way. And this psalm is really so painful because the author's in the depths of his own depression. And the end is kind of I don't know, a hopeful tinge of writing a different kind of narrative about the righteous or the other ways it was translated. And I just would like to see the next addendum to this as a different narrative of the person writing himself out of his depression. And I think the beautiful thought is when you have somebody to listen and you speak to them, that's how you get out of your depths. And so I'm deeply moved by it, and the lesson is very rich. And since I have the floor, want to just thank you, Rabbi Spitz, for being such a great and amazing influence on me and on our whole community. And in this year of retirement, I'm thinking of the words of Henry Adams, who said, "A teacher affects eternity. He can never tell where his influence stops." And you will be teaching long after your retirement, my friend. And we are very, very lucky to have you as one of our teachers. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Question on that note.
Yeah.
Back to verse 4.
Yeah.
Which really,
I'm gonna pull it up so we can all look at verse 4.
I pulled out the altar and I pulled out the JPS, and they translated differently. I like your translation the best, but they said, "When my spirit faints within me."
Yeah.
I don't understand that. Behitatef makes so much more sense, particularly the way it is written here. I don't understand that. Can you help me?
Yeah.
Why they translate it like that?
So the word appears in two other Psalms, 143:4 and 141, verses 9 to 10. And what they're doing is going one step further, and that is literally the root, lehitatef, is to enwrap or to envelop, like a ma'atafa in modern Hebrew, an envelope. And what they're doing is the next step, which is trying to put it in context and say, well, what does that mean when you say that my spirit enwraps me? They say, well, that means that I'm faint. So essentially, they're adding, if you will, a simpler way to explain it. And when I do the translations, what I try to do is stay as close to the literal meaning, and with that, to convey the ambiguity. So others will translate instead of faint, some will say, like Mitsuda, with affliction, my spirit is afflicting. Bottom line, those are moving away from the literal. And that's one of the things I have found in doing this project is I've done my own translations, but it's not by looking only at the Hebrew. I look at about 10 or other translations, including always the King James Version, which I find fascinating, just to see the choices that translators make. And often, as in this case, the translators seek to fill in what it means to be enwrapped, to say afflicted or fainting. But I like the ambiguity and the poetry of the image. And for me, the image is back to feeling enclosed, because that's the feeling of depression, that you're like enwrapped, you can't get out. It's your own soul that's your cave. Yeah. Thank you for looking at Robert Alter. He's one of those that I always go to because he's an important scholar of our day. Shula, go ahead. A comment?
Yes. I find one of the beauties of this particular psalm is that it creates certain sounds that are very feeling and fascinating. And particularly that word which repeats, which is ezak. You know, there is a word very similar, which would be etzak with the tzadi. I would translate that one as shout out. Ezak, zoek versus tzoek. Zoek is more somebody who is crying out, in other words, almost like a wail. It's a sound of more pain, of more fear. In fact, in modern Hebrew today, the word for siren, I remember in the War of Independence,
right.
as you recall, was azaka, azaka, right? With a zayin. So here we are. The sound is of a wailing cry, which fits the verb of etchanan, of pleading, and therefore also the verb of pouring. It's all, the sounds are a lot more heart-rending. And therefore, when it comes back to verse 6, where it says za'akti, I can see why the one in verse 7 could be my joy, saying that I am pouring in, but I'm also rejoicing. Either way, the sounds I make to you, they are because daloti. I am such a nothing, and please listen to me. You are my portion in the life to come, or in the land of life, or something.
Well, I'm going to change my translation after we're off. Instead of shout, to wail, because you are reminding me that a siren, as you say in modern Hebrew, is a za'akah, and that's more piercing quality than simply shouting. It's wailing, or, you know, so I'm going to change the translation. And that's great. Now, again, modern Hebrew is not necessarily the way words were understood in the Bible. That's also to be acknowledged. And yet, we bring our own ears and sensitivities to the reading. And where this is the way siren was chosen in modern Hebrew, there's no reason not to read it back in. And all the more, as you say, Shula, this is, by the way, the one verb that is repeated of all those synonyms that are chosen. And it really is the key image of wailing out, of pouring oneself out. It's much more primal than simply shouting. So thank you. A closing comment? Go ahead, Chuck.
Back to verse 4, V'hitatef. I think we mentioned that's the verb we use, V'hitatef b'tzitzit. We don't say who commanded us to tie the tzitzit on the corners of our clothing, but rather to wrap ourselves in the tzitzit, meaning to wrap ourselves in the clothing that happens to have the tzitzit on it.
Right.
And this serves to, it will increase my kavanah when I say this blessing in the future. It caused me to think more about it.
So that's a great also association verbally, Chuck. And that is the first word of verse 4, which Rabbi Steinberg brought to our attention with these other translations, as in Robert Alter, which is there, when my spirit faints. We say, Lihitatef b'tzitzit, we are enwrapped with tzitzit. We're enwrapped with the talit that has tzitzit. Mm-hmm. And so the image of being enwrapped is either to feel embraced. There's a Rabbi Schulweis once wrote an article in which he referred to those who give us bear hugs to seek to convert us. So that, meaning there's a hug and then there's, like the bear hug. In this case, you can be enwrapped by the talit, embraced, or in a state of despair, you can feel closed off by the same act. And that notion of either or, the paradox of being enwrapped, is also evidenced here. To pull it together, this is a psalm also about being enwrapped. Enwrapped either by darkness, by being in the cave, or encircled by the righteous and feeling God's light. And which direction it goes, how it is experienced, as Rabbi Steinberg said, Are you empowered or a victim? Depends on your narrative. And as he also noted, you can have both simultaneously be true. And so this short psalm contains these clearly a yearning, a za'akah, a wailing, and yet the possibility of being enwrapped by the righteous, being crowned by God. So Psalm 142, again, I thank you, my friend, Rabbi Rick, for allowing us to honor you in this study today.